Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be given mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons and daughters of God. And blessed are the persecuted, for great is their reward in heaven. Now, many, if not all of us here, are aware that that passage I just recited is known as the Beatitudes. It's known as the Beatitudes. And there are versions of the Beatitudes that are found in Matthew and in Luke, both. The version that I recited is from Matthew. And the word beatitude isn't actually found in the Bible at all. It's from the Latin word for blessing, and it's believed to have been coined by the Roman philosopher Cicero. And, you know, the Beatitudes mean many different things to many different people. It's a mystical passage in many ways, as I kind of talked about in the little Adventist Today blurb for this lecture this week. You know, some interpreters have described it as Jesus' announcement of God's core values. It's been described as a vision of alternate community, a blessing from God himself. And for me, the Beatitudes are really a divine judgment. The creator of the universe sides with the oppressed. And so for our presentation today, I want to reflect a little bit with you on the Beatitudes from my position as an Adventist, as a pastor, and as a transgender woman. And in particular, I want to share a little bit about how the meaning of this text has changed for me over time, and especially as I've gone through the process of transition. So just I want to say thank you to Loewen for your invitation. Loewen has been incredibly thoughtful and sweet and helpful to me through this process. And especially I value his intentionality in trying to include me in this little community that you all have created here with each other. And so just a tiny bit about my background. If you read anything from the bio on the Adventist Today website, I grew up in Walla Walla. Dean Loewen from Walla Walla is my grandfather. We actually just passed the 10-year anniversary of his passing 3 days ago. And
he was the boys' dean for many of us.
Yeah, right. From like the mid 60s until the later 80s or so, right? Or at least he was on campus then. I don't think he was a dean that whole time. But I grew up in Walla Walla, and I pastored in the UCC, not the United Church of Christ, but the Upper Columbia Conference. And I pastored in the SECC. I was at the Walla Walla University Church for 10 years. I wrote a book about keeping secrets. And it's called Hidden, and you can learn more about it on my website if you want. And I'm right now working on a master's degree in marriage and family therapy through Alliant University. And in about 2 weeks' time, I'm going to start my clinical rotation in Palm Springs at the LGBTQ Center of the Desert. And I'm extremely thrilled to be able to go there, and they're thrilled that I'm coming there to be with them. So that will take about a year, and then I'll be done with that program. So I've been attending this group, this class for, I don't know, since last summer, kind of off and on. And I'll just say it's been a gift for me to attend a group that is, you know, Adventist, even if it's digital, like has Adventist roots, and yet is you know, an affirming community that intentionally welcomes other people who look like me and who have the experience that I have. It's been a really a gift, and it's unique in a lot of ways. So thank you for what you do. It's been an honor to join you over the weeks, and it's an honor to join you today. And I also want to say that a couple weeks ago, I preached this sermon, or a version of this sermon, at Paradox Church in Redlands, which is a local church that meets on Saturdays, that is not an Adventist church, but has some folks, has some Adventist connections. And one of their traditions at Paradox is that sermons are not intended to be authoritative endings of conversations, but instead are intended to be contributions among a chorus of wisdom. And, I want to say that some of what I have to say may not resonate with you today, and I understand that. And my hope is that through my sharing, your journey will be enriched, and also that I might continue to be able to honestly reclaim my faith that's been questioned and maligned by my church from my youth. And so in a lot of ways, sharing today with you, for me, is an act of spiritual survival. It's a way for me to take ownership and agency over my own faith and my own walk with God. So I'm glad you're with me for that. And the Beatitudes. After all that, let's dive into the Beatitudes. I want to start with a confession, and that's that I did just recite the Beatitudes from memory, but I have to admit that I feel a little bit sheepish about having done that, because for me, the Beatitudes the fact that I have the Beatitudes memorized, it doesn't represent like one drop in a bucket amidst a vast library of texts that I have committed to memory. Instead, the truth is that I have like 3 verses in my memory. It's like, it's very few. And what's funny is that, for me, I have like a lot of like internalized shame and inadequacy and just not feeling good enough when it comes to thinking about like committing the text to scripture. Like I mentioned, I grew up in Adventist. I went to Adventist schools all the way through elementary school, all the way through college. I didn't finish my seminary degree at Andrews, but I completed a significant portion of that degree there. And all through that education, the importance of committing the text to memory was consistent. It was there all along, repeated over and over. And depending on the teacher, there were some teachers who would make it quite explicit that, we need to memorize the text because there's going to come a time when you won't have access to your Bible anymore, and your memory will be the only way that you have it. And so there was this urgency and anxiety about it. I remember one of my favorite teachers in college was Alden Thompson. And if you don't know this about him, he has a great library of things committed to memory, that dwarf my 1 or 2 items. But I always admired him, but it was always intimidated by that, amazing practice that he's had. I remember when I was in 6th grade, my class memorized the book of Ephesians, and we went to a retirement center to like recite it all. And like, I've preached a lot of sermons in my life, and I've seen like a lot of glazed over looks, but still nothing has come to the surface of that, the moment of people trying to listen to 30 minutes of 10-year-olds reciting Ephesians to them. But, for me, the message that I internalized all those years, and here's a couple of pictures from way back then. And just as an aside, I'm going to show quite a few pictures of myself from my childhood and from my pre-transition life. For me, I feel very comfortable doing that. I'm an integrated person, the way that I lived then was still me. But, you know, the fact that I'm doing this does not mean, like, I don't think for those of you who are cisgender or who are not trans, I don't think you should automatically like assume that it's therefore okay to show such pictures of other people, you know, like I'm doing this with and for you and I feel okay with it, but that doesn't, you know, mean, and a lot of trans people, you know, they don't want to see or be seen as the way that they presented prior to transition. In any case, the messages that I internalized as a child and as a teenager about the Bible and about memorizing the Bible was no more, try harder, be holier, you're never doing enough, you're never doing it. And so it's kind of ironic and a little bit hilarious to me that I, you know, I'm beginning a sermon by reciting a text because it's just not been a super huge part of my life, except for the Beatitudes. And interestingly enough, it was actually a Buddhist therapist who encouraged me to reconsider this spiritual practice. You know, I remember I was sitting in session with him and he said, you know, isn't you know, memorizing the Bible part of the Christian tradition? You know, what if you incorporated that into your, you know, mindfulness stuff that we're doing together? And I was like, well, yeah, I don't know. Okay, well, give it a try. And it was about 10 years ago. I was in therapy because I was having a lot of anxiety about my my body and my weight, especially. My weight was at kind of an all-time high, and my eating was poorly regulated. And I was a new parent, and I was fairly new at the university church, and I was a relatively new pastor. And there was a lot going on. And in fact, I was actually originally went to this therapist as a workup prior to getting bariatric surgery. You know, my weight was quite high, and part of the work of you know, getting worked up for bariatric surgery is going to therapy. And so this therapist recommended it, and the Beatitudes for me, they became my go-to text during this time. I adopted the habit of memorizing, and specifically of memorizing and saying to myself the Beatitudes. And so when I think about, for example, the last thing I remember prior to going under anesthesia before my surgery, it was the Beatitudes. That's the last thing that I said, but that wasn't the end of it. When I was training for marathons after I had lost all that weight, you know, the Beatitudes became in a lot of ways a mantra for me. I would say it as I was out logging long miles, doing the training. You know, over the years when different life stresses bubbled up, whether it was my Kickstarter project with the book, or job interviews, or church drama, or political elections, or whatever, the Beatitudes became something that calmed me. The practice of reciting the Beatitudes helped keep me oriented during the pandemic. And, you know, it's funny thinking about this picture. It was taken in my office during that long period where I was doing sermons from my office. And this morning, it kind of brought up all this old stuff, all these, you know, that old experience, because I have my whole studio here, and it's you know, it's pretty behind me, but like it's a disaster everywhere else. It's fantastic. Anyway, but you know, it really became an important part of my life. Hold on a second, I'm gonna adjust the lighting. There we go. The Beatitudes gave me strength as I waited outside the headquarters of the regional headquarters of the denomination prior to the meeting where I came out to them as transgender. And the Beatitudes were a balm for me a few minutes later, at the realization that I would be losing my vocation because of this part of my identity. I recited the Beatitudes many, many, many times daily through the process of transition during the last 12, 14 months. And in a lot of ways, it became this insubordinate assertion of my belonging, that I am the beloved. You know, I tell you all of these things about the Beatitudes to illustrate their importance to me over the course of a long period of time. And it's because the Beatitudes have been such a consistent part of my spiritual practice that I think that this text in particular becomes a case study for how the meaning of Scripture can change over time and from person to person. Now, if I were giving like a formal lecture, my main argument might be something like this. You know, the meaning of the Bible is highly plastic. It's highly malleable to people, places, times, and experiences. The reader's context influences what it means. And you know, if I were giving this audio, or if I'm giving this theoretical formal lecture, if I was giving it to an Adventist audience, I might also expect some raised eyebrows at this thesis. So, you know, just remember, like I talked about Paradox Church, you know, and their kind of tradition of like a humble contribution amidst the wisdom. So just, you know, like hold on to that spirit if you can, stick with me. But, you know, in many Adventist circles, you know, to suggest that the Bible can change in its meaning from time to time, or that it's subjective in any way, or it can change from person to person, that would kind of be like fighting words. You know, it might be even labeled heretical. You know, for me today, it's just obvious. I mean, it's been hard won through my own life experience to the point that it would be silly to suggest otherwise. And yet at the same time, for me, it was very unexpected to learn that. And so this morning, what I want to do with you is, instead of arguing this thesis directly, I want to illustrate it by sharing with you my own journey with how I have seen and understood the Beatitudes over time, and especially through my transition. Okay? So for a great deal of my life, I read the Beatitudes aspirationally. That is, I read them as an ideal to strive for. They describe the state of things that as a person I will never attain, but I should try to be like them as much as possible. And you know, for a lot of my life, I was far too privileged to realize and to see what's obvious to me now, which is the Beatitudes are far more pragmatic and tangible than they are, you know, ethereal, like this reading tends to imply. So, for example, let's see. I was far more comfortable with Matthew's paraphrase than of Luke's version of the first Beatitude. If you're familiar, Luke's Beatitude reads, "Blessed are the poor." But then Matthew expands it slightly, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now, no one knows exactly, like, you know, what was going through the scribe's mind as they made this minor adjustment, but I can't help but wonder if they felt some personal discomfort of you know, Luke's version, and so they kind of broadened it and made it a little bit more comfortable for maybe someone who was more comfortable financially. I don't know, but that was the case for me. I resonated with Francis Nichols' take on the second Beatitude. You may be familiar with his name. He's one of the editors of the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary, and his take on "blessed are those who mourn" echoes that which is given by Ellen White in the Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, where the mourning that Jesus is talking about here is specifically about individual soul-level heart mourning for sin. I remember preaching sermons about meekness, where I sounded a lot like Mark Driscoll, to my horror today. I remember talking about how meekness was not about being quiet or submissive or gentle. No, 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 no. I preach specifically about how the word meek in the Sermon on the Mount is the word praus, which is sometimes referred to talk about oxen or other beasts of burden. And so meekness is about strength, but that is disciplined, and in my mind, I think the what I pictured for meekness back then was like, someone who goes to Walmart with a giant 45 caliber gun on their holster and they just happen to make it out without shooting anyone. That's meek, right? As an undergrad student, I loved Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I read all of his stuff, and his take on the fourth beatitude really resonated with me, where he talked about how hungering and thirst for righteousness is about forgiveness of sin, longing for the forgiveness of all sin, for complete renewal, for the establishment of God's law on earth. His interpretation of the fifth beatitude, I similarly enjoyed, where he has this kind of very similar individualized focus, where the merciful are described almost like in an evangelistic way. They go out and seek all who are enmeshed in sin and guilt. No sin is too appalling for the pity of the merciful. At an earlier time in my life, I would have enthusiastically absorbed the Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon's teaching about being pure in heart, where he essentially equates it to being sanctified or holy before God. Impurity of the heart, says the great orator, is the cause of spiritual blindness. Our inner nature must be divinely renewed. It must be purified. As a young minister and college student who is deeply, deeply, deeply conflicted about her relationship to God, the Reformed theologian John Piper's discussion about being a peacemaker were right up my alley. The most important peace, according to Piper, is the peace that's made between you and God. And secondarily, once that happens, that we Christians go out and make peace between other people and God as well, which is an interesting position, I think, from a Reformed theologian, but that's a whole different conversation. And of course, I can't leave out evangelicalism's Franklin Graham on persecution, who speaks a lot about persecution. And now I'm tipping my hand to you just a bit, Franklin Graham, who teaches us about persecution in tweets and sound bites, who teaches us that persecution is being forced to live in a world where LGBTQ people exist, where Black lives matter, and where the patriarchy is dismantled. Now, as I think about all of these individuals today, all of these different teachers, all of these different perspectives, an aspirational lens on the Beatitudes isn't the only thing that they have in common. I'll just let that sit with you for a moment. A pithier version of my thesis might read, identity shapes hermeneutic. Identity shapes hermeneutic. Now, if your first thought when you hear the word hermeneutic is who is she and what, or who is he and what kind of person names their kid Eudic? My kids call me Mappa, but we laugh a lot about the fact that I have not given up dad jokes at all. So hermeneutic is a familiar term probably to theologians, but pretty much to no one else. It just means interpretation style. It means the way that we come at the Bible, or even communication style. It's the lens through which that we read and interpret the Bible and the world. And so I think identity shapes hermeneutic. Identity shapes hermeneutic. Our position in society, who we are in context, deeply affects the ways in which we read and understand the Bible. And the more privileged we are, the less obvious this fact may be. As a woman of transgender experience, my relationship to privilege isn't a simple one. I did live a good deal of my life presenting as, and even doing my very best to identify as, a boy and a man. But at the same time, my cisgender male friends moved through the world with a whole different level of male privilege than I ever did. Unlike them, my masculinity was always a compulsory performance, not a voluntary one, but a compulsory performance for my own safety. Instead of being natural or joyful or empowering, for me, my masculinity was different. Pretending to be a man while stuck in the closet felt like being held captive to a sociopath who pledged to not hurt me as long as I kept it all a secret. For me, male privilege was real, but it was absolutely terrifying because it represented the depths of threat that I faced if anyone ever found out that my performance wasn't real. And let's be clear for just a moment before I go on. I might be trans, but I'm still incredibly privileged. I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm conventionally abled, I'm educated, I'm married, I'm a fertile parent of 2 children. Like, I have a lot of privilege in my life. Let's just be clear about that. And so for me, in the past, I was able to find peace in more privileged interpretations of the text that were shared by those who were at the apex of power in their societies at the time. And in some ways, I probably still do find peace from those interpretations. But at least for me, as I've gone through the process of transition, it's become very, very difficult to maintain those perspectives. And so what I've seen is that the Beatitudes, this hugely, hugely important text for me that's drawn out over more than a decade of my life, it's been impossible to read it the same way. It's changed, even as I continue to recite it, often multiple times every day. So today, when I read the Beatitudes, like, for example, when I read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit" as my full self, I can't help but think about how transitioning has accentuated my otherness in the world. I can't help but think about what it feels like to be clocked as transgender by a perfect stranger on the street. I can't help but think about what it feels like to be pitied or to be feared. When I think about being poor in spirit, I think about how so many of my former colleagues and friends and church members and on and on and on have distanced themselves from me, or who have not said a word to me in more than a year. I can't help but think about the loved ones who have spoken up with awfulness. I have one friend who, we were in each other's weddings, and they sent me what they called a final communication, where they dismissed me as being selfish and frivolous and said, "Don't ever speak to me again." That's what I think about when I hear "Blessed are the poor in spirit." When I read "Blessed are those who mourn" as my full self, I can't help but think of the inexplicable pain of gender dysphoria, which is defined as this overwhelming emotional suffering that derives from feeling mismatches between our own self-perception and the identity that society tells us we are, based on how we look and our bodies and our language and our clothing and our roles. When I think about the blessing of mourning, I think about how terrifying it was to be in a place of actively and sincerely weighing the pros and cons of suicide after finally beginning to level with myself about who I actually am. I think of the nearly half of all trans people who will attempt to kill themselves in their lifetimes, a rate at nearly 10 times the average. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, instead of resonating with the voices that I highlighted earlier, I'm seeing a shift. Living as myself has led me to echo the experiences of other folks who are marginalized, folks that are minority theologians. I've resonated with teachers like Nadia Boltz-Weber, who in her own version of the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are the agnostics, those who doubt and who aren't sure, for they can still be surprised." I resonate with the late Mary Oliver, who in her poem On the Uses of Sorrow writes, "Someone I love once gave me a box full of darkness, and it took me years to realize that this too was a gift." I resonate with liberation theologians like James Cone and Martin Luther King Jr., who correctly identify, remind us that hungering and thirsting for righteousness has precious little to do with personal piety or individual salvation, but instead is about longing for justice by those who have been denied it. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness sits squarely within the prophetic tradition, the type of justice that we read about in Isaiah that will roll once down like a mighty river. I resonate with Rachel Held Evans, who summarized when she was still living, "We're happy when we're growing." My soul welled up when I heard the story of the late Bishop Desmond Tutu, who reflected on the blessing of persecution as he was speaking before representatives of the apartheid South African legislature at the time. And he spoke up and said, "Since you've already lost, come and join the winning side." I resonate with queer liberation theologians like Jonathan Bates, who turns the table on unaffirming theology that's terrified of seeing its system crumble, and turns the table and says, look, queer theology says that your queerness, that thing about yourself that you hate, the thing that you're hiding and you don't want anyone to know, the thing that you're most ashamed of, what if God gave you that thing as a gift for your own joy and for the healing of the world? Wow. So for me, Miss L, my own transgender hermeneutic, draws me to see the Beatitudes as descriptive of the heart of God, a defiant reaffirmation of my belonging with God that has been so questioned. God is on the side of the oppressed, I read in that text now. You, Esther Loewen, you are of heaven, and I bless you. To make it a little bit more visceral, when I read and recite the Beatitudes today for myself, it feels a little bit what it feels like to have your family and your friends in your corner. It feels a little bit like having them back there saying, "We got your back. We're with you." And as it happens, I know exactly what that feels like. It happened just a few months ago. You may have read about it on social media in unkind ways, but I wrote a transition ceremony. It's something that trans Christians have done for some time, but it's certainly not very well known in the cultural zeitgeist because we're rare, and a lot of people assume that you can't be a Christian and be transgender, which is a lie. So I wrote this ceremony of transition, and I needed it for me because I needed to reclaim my own faith and to share the fact that my transition was blessed by God fully. And there's this highly ritualized liturgy where we walk through all these different activities and song to celebrate what God was doing in my life and in the life of my family. And in many ways, we acted out the Beatitudes communally. We named the ashes of loss, and we affirmed the beauty of transition. And we had a renaming ceremony. My mom and my dad, who were not married to each other at this time, were both there and spoke my new name over me and over my community. And I cannot tell you how much that means to me, even today. And one of my colleagues was there from pastoral ministry, and she blessed me with the oil of the spirits. Chris Oberg blessed me with the oil of the Spirit over this process. It was an absolutely incredible experience to go through, and it's one that in many ways is visceral, a visceral reality of what it feels like, or what the Beatitudes mean and feel like to me today. There's nothing you can do to make God love you less. So today I began our time together with a recitation of the Beatitudes from the NIV. And that's the version that I have memorized, and that's the version that I will continue to pray every night as I go to sleep. But I want to close with my own rendition of the Beatitudes that's been shaped by my transgender hermeneutic. And so I'm going to offer this version of the Beatitudes as our closing benediction today. So I invite you to pray with me. Blessed are people who self-harm. Blessed are the hopeless, the traumatized, the disassociated, and the depressed. You belong. Blessed are those with scars on their bodies and on their hearts, whose souls have been shocked by the brutality of life. For it is they who know the meaning of love and of healing. The creator of the universe sides with the people who keep their heads down, those who have absorbed shame and microaggressions and discrimination, who are now too weary to speak up. She sides with those who are in the closet hiding to stay safe. You are enough. God is on the side of the wrongly convicted and the punitively punished. The divine marches with protesters of injustice. They speak through community educators and activists, and they inspire prophets of futures not their own. The merciful are the lucky ones. In their weakness, they are strong. They're blessed by going to coffee with bigots and giving truth to the ignorant and returning insults with calm boundaries. They've struck the mystical jackpot by maintaining their dignity, even when soaked in the contempt of those who don't believe them. Blessed are the trans kids, whose pure hearts long just to express themselves and to be cherished and to be protected. Blessed are those who open their vulnerable hearts to the world, for it is only they who feel joy. Blessed are the peacemakers who shapeshift to belong, who don't have any identity or opinion, but hide in the reflection of other people's projections. You are God's children. And blessed are the persecuted, those who are forced to resign for being themselves, who are vilified and misunderstood and called names, who risk their lives by driving to the store, who are shot on the street by representatives of the state. Blessed are the persecuted, those who are raped and not believed, whose access to basic rights are legislated out of existence. God is on your side. This is not the end. Amen.